go over to the actual review of the latest or only newer Polish language narratives about the Holocaust for children and adolescents, I would like to make a few points. I believe that this introduction will allow, first of all, to place the corpus of text that I'm interested in the continuity of the literary history process. Secondly, it will make it possible to look at the child as a literary figure, one of the protagonists of the Holocaust literature. Third and finally, it will lead to the child as the recipient of a literary text based on a traumatic, full of death, harm, pain, heartbreaking experience, or its post-memorial expression. I would like to add that I'm interested in the text without illustrations, images, which are in children's books. I want to tell about the world of the ghetto, which is presented in words. First part. A child in the latest Polish literature about the Holocaust, a historical and literary perspective. In Poland, in the most famous read and discussed works about the Holocaust, the child was not a leading figure for a long time, and his war fate was treated only marginally. After all, adults wrote down their own war experiences and put it in literary terms, wrote about matters which belonged to their world, commented and organized them. This does not mean that the child was not present in these narratives at all. A symptomatic example of early writers' reactions to the Holocaust are certainly camp stories by Lubelski and medallions by Zofia Nałkowska, well known in Poland and around the world. I will remind two excerpts from these publications. The first citation comes from This Way to Gas, ladies and gentlemen. Quote, "The train was being emptied. A thin, pock-marked assessment peers inside, shakes his head in disgust and motions to our group, pointing his finger at the door. Rain, clean it up. We climb inside. In the corners, amid human excrement and abandoned wristwatches, lie squashed, trampled infants, naked little monsters with enormous heads and bloated bellies. We carry them out like chickens, holding several in each hand." End of quote. And another, from the medallion, "The Adults and Children of Auschwitz," by Zofia Nałkowska. Quote, "Dr. Epstein, a professor from Prague, was crossing the street between the barracks in Auschwitz on a pleasant summer day when he noticed two young children sitting in the sand and poking at something with a stick. He stopped and asked, 'What are you doing?' He received in reply, 'We're playing at burning Jews.'" End of quote. Especially the second fragment, closing the volume of Nałkowska's stories, made a great impression on the recipients. It is clearly visible in the reception, in the multitude of comments, references, and in the reviews and later critical studies. The image of children playing burning Jews must shock the reader because it considered the following reflection: war corrupts, mentally destroys everyone, even children, who are after all innocent and pure. Children who have experienced war cease to be children. They cannot play normally as they would have played if the war had not broken out, if they had not been forced to observe their other people being murdered, if they had not finally accepted that this is just what the world is like. Nałkowska intentionally places this fragment at the end of the volume in a story which is a kind of her commentary to the reality presented in the collection. It is to stay with the reader. It is to shock as if the writer was pointing to. If, after reading the following medallions, you feel terrified, then look what I left for the end, the children. It should be mentioned here that right after the war, there were publications written in the Jewish and Polish perspective in which the child was a leading figure, and his fate was presented by an adult observer. To recall only The Children of the Ghetto by Stefania Grodzkiej, our present at school readings list in the 40s, Traces by Ludwig, as well as ballads and romances by Władysław Doniecki. However, these works were either not more widely known, were released in single editions, and thus did not function in the readership circulation, or they were read from and University's that worked in two ways. The first way is based on the following assumption. All children, both Polish and Jewish, suffered during the war. In this view, this issue was discussed during Polish language lessons in the communist period. The second way of the aforementioned methods of universalization led to diagnosis. This happens to all Jews, which means that the experience of a child, both a boy and a girl, could not be exposed as separate and impotent, just like for a very long time the female experience. Discussions which took place in this matter clearly show how great is the resistance of researchers to such a distinction, to make such a distinction. At this point, one more addition is necessary. At school, as compulsory reading, pupils read and still read works about the Holocaust that were not written with a child audience in mind, even not with young people in mind. There are several nodal points, group of texts whose appearance had a fundamental impact on thinking about children as protagonists of war narratives and, above all, subjects of the Holocaust experience, which is particularly important in the context of the topic discussed in this lecture. The first group includes the Wartime Diaries, and we talked about today. Wartime Diaries of the Children of the Holocaust, such as Memoir of Dawid Lubinowicz, the Diary of Dawid Sierakowiak, published for the first time in 1960, Memoir of Ludka Raskier, published in 26, or Diary of Renia Nol. Małgorzata Wójcik-Dudek, in a work dedicated to them, indicates, quote, the influence of the Holocaust journals on contemporary literary texts addressed to children, stylized as Holocaust diaries, and states, quote, it took time to give children narratives the status of full-fledged stories whose plots are adequate to the narrative abilities of their authors. Recently, fragmentary children's stories were often referred to as naive, previously outside the mainstream of the Holocaust narrative, have gained access to the space of negotiating the representation of Holocaust. The micro-narratives of the younger create a counter-story situated at the other extreme of monumental history, official history, end of quote. And these diaries, this is the first group. The second group consists of autobiographical novels, but representatives of the generation of children of the Holocaust, or in other words, of late speech writers, because these authors are sometimes classified as such. These two terms, so children of the Holocaust and late speech writers, present in Polish literature studies, indicate the specificity of this group of authors and works signed with their names. Therefore, they are those who survived the Holocaust as children, but decided to talk about their experiences many years after the end of the war, when they were adults. It is significant that these authors write about the war from the perspective of a child in the first person. They try to stay faithful to those states, emotions, and diagnoses they were capable of when they were children. Not without significance in the context of the topic undertaken here is also the tension that arises in these works at the junction of what is remembered and what results from post-memory. The reception of these publications, to mention only the works of Henryk Lindbergh, Bogdan Wojdowski, Wilhelm Dichter, or Michał Kowinski, although different, allows one to draw the fundamental, thought probably not very revealing conclusion today. The child's perspective is different, it should be appreciated, it should be perceived as the separate and requiring description. First-person perspective of child narrator can successfully be used in a story about the Holocaust. So this is the second group. The third group consists of memoirs and diaries published in Poland in significant numbers immediately after the war and later in the 1980s, whose authors are Polish and Jewish women, to mention only Krystyna Żywulska, Zofia Posmysz, Irena Birnbaum, Noemi Schatz-Weinkrantz, Janina Bauman. The publication of the last of the following, Monomis Moria Rome with Fire and Winter in the Morning, coincides with the opening of Polish literature and culture to the subject of the Holocaust in the 1980s, as well as with the establishment of a feminist perspective in Holocaust research, initially in the West, later also in Poland. The beginning of the 21st century brings a number of research works in which women's narratives are treated as sources of information about the Holocaust, supplementing the state of research on this experience. In the context of reflection on the place that the child takes in the field of this literature, both as a recipient and descender of the message, it seems reasonable to point out that the feminist perspective in Holocaust research means a research attitude that, first of all, brings a clear distinction between victims on men, women, and children. Secondly, indicates that the experiences of representatives of each of these groups were different, not only because they were treated differently by the perpetrators, for example, selection process upon arrival at the camp, but also because they performed different roles due to their own social cultural position, established before the war and modified while it lasted. Therefore, what follows from the postulates of the researchers of this trend, just as we are not able to create a full story about the Holocaust, all those who experienced it, differing in terms of sex, age, education, or economic situation, should be taken into account in the effort of reconstruct this experience. And the fourth and the last group that I want to talk about is the corpus intended for the youngest readers and the changes taking place within it. Małgorzata Wójcik-Dudek, who has already been quoted here, rightly points out that from the post-war period until the beginning of the 21st century, when the most interesting works appear in publications addressed to children, the Holocaust, if it's mentioned, functions only on the fringe of the main thread. The reason for the surplus of the representation that we have dealt with the last 2 decades may be explained by cultural changes influencing both the attitude towards children and leading to the regulation of restrictions imposed so far on literature for the youngest, which leads, according to Dudek and Aleksandra Sikora, to introduce into its scope the subjects that have been tabooed so far. Therefore, it is allowed to tell children about human physiology, sexuality, loneliness, disabilities, problems of faith, death, and war, including the Holocaust. The loss of the market, in this case the publishing market and its specific part, which are publications for children and young people, also play a significant role here, because undoubtedly the multiplicity of publications on war and the Holocaust that have appeared in Poland from the beginning of the century is also influenced by demand. Revenues of children's book publishers are constantly growing. In books written in the 21st century, which I analyzed in this text, I will not list all the titles, you can see them in the presentation. The child is the main protagonist. The world of war is presented and the narrative is conducted from the child's perspective. It is his or her experiences that build the action. And finally, the kids and teenagers are recipients of these stories. They are adapted to their age and cognitive abilities, what has its consequences and influences the shape of the represented world, and therefore the image of the Holocaust passed in the works. This is the end of the first part. And now the second part, the ghetto as an area of in the physical sense and a space of existence. The ghetto is one of the spaces, or in other words, one of the stages of the Holocaust, according to Jan Grabowski's division into 3 stages of the Holocaust: the concentration phase, the ghetto, the extermination phase, the death camp, and Judenjagd, hunting for Jews. So the ghetto dominates the books for children and adolescents analyzed here. This does not mean that the action of individual stories takes place primarily in the ghettos. Most often it remains stretched between the two living spaces of the children's characters, between the ghetto and the Aryan side. One is in the ghetto. The ghetto is mentioned. Finally, one hears about the ghetto. One knows about the ghetto. The scope of acquaintance with the subject is, of course, conditioned above all by their origin. The knowledge of Jewish children about the ghetto is different than that of Polish children, which is articulated in the text and is understandable. So we see the ghetto from two perspectives. This picture is certainly complemented by the reflections of those Jewish characters who recall the time before the war. In the perspective of this comparison, situate and describe the ghetto. In works for children and teenagers dealing with the subject of the Holocaust, the Warsaw Ghetto is most often mentioned. Just like in Andrzej Marii Grabowski's The War on the Beautiful Shore, Irena Landau's The Top Floor, or Adam Michajda's The Treasure of the Ghetto and Cezary Harasymowicz's Miracle. Less often in Łódź, as in Jutka's Insomnia by Dorota Cemrzyńska novella, which is no surprising in connection with the fact that they were the largest ghettos. They are also the most famous. In individual cases, Krakow, as in Katarzyna Rylik, Mr. Apoteker, and Będzin, as in Rutka by Zbigniew Białas. Although there are also other smaller provincial ghettos to summon, the ghetto in Grudek Jagielloński from The Displaced of Dorota Cemrzyńska novella, and the ghetto in Rożyszcze in Wołynia from Pepe's Unfinished Story by the same author. Often also ghettos, the location of which is not specified. The young reader only learns that they existed and had certain peculiarities that distinguished them from the rest of the world, as in the Auntie's Lucia's Home by Krzysztof Stręczok, quote, "The ghetto is a place surrounded by walls where all Jews were ordered to live, and they could not go beyond these walls. Terrible punishments could be made for attempting to escape." End of quote. This is how the ghetto is defined, as an enclosed, cut-off space, also in the other publications for younger children, including Ada Judytka and the Missing Tali by Agnieszka Suchowielska, whose action takes place in Białystok today. End quote. The ghetto is a separate part of the city where people are forced to live. They cannot leave it, and they do not have various things. They are in all other districts. End of quote. In Jutka's Insomnia, the ghetto is a closed, strange place, fenced with barbed wire. Sometimes this space is described with sentences about the construction of a negative. For example, when Jutka is dreaming, quote, "There were no barbed wire lines and a separate city prison, Jewish police and German guards at all." End of quote. Information about strictly spatial limitations is also accompanied by additions that complete the image of a closed district, as in an area in the physical sense and as a space of existence. Most often, in those approaches that serve as definitions explanations, characteristic phenomena of life in the ghettos are indicated. Quote, "There are more diseases in ghetto, and sometimes there is a shortage of food." End of quote. Often combined with expressions with an emotive function. An example, "There was terrible, sad, hungry, dangerous, disease raged," or "Here it is, terrible." End of quote. It can be said, simplifying a bit, that a ghetto is most often defined by a lack. In publications intended for younger readers, the deficiencies of what should constitute the basis, but also a kind of standard of even the most modest existence, are presented as most acutely felt by children. In books addressed to teenagers, problems multiply, as do the characteristics of the ghetto as a place become more complex. The basic element in the ghetto is the lack of food, hunger, which appears in almost every story. This motive is presented in several versions in Jutka's Insomnia. Aunt Estera is so hungry that in the fairy tales she tells, the poisoned apple bitten by Snow White becomes a roll with sausage, and the fruit itself turns out to be not a prop from a fairy tale, but an object of size, kosztela. It is known in Poland as very tasty variety of apple, and quote, dotted as if sprinkled with vanilla, sweet, so sweet, end of quote. The child will, of course, be entertained by a mistake, a funny roll with sausage, which in no way fits the fairy tale. The young recipient may be surprised, however, why Szewczyk Dratewka received cigarettes for killing the Wawel dragon, but he didn't get the princess for his wife. It is clear for an adult reader that Esther's sleepiness results from the permanent hunger. Jutka's aunt is extremely weakened after exhausting work in the department of rubber coats in the Litzmann ghetto. A piece of bread spread with margarine, which Jutka's grandfather hung to the birds, evokes great emotions, quarrels between adults and children, to which I return later. Josef, Jutka's friend, says, quote, he could have given this bread and this margarine to my family. I would eat it. I would eat some, he said heroically, almost with tears in his eyes, and I would give some to my sister, end of quote. Often images of hunger lead to a vision of its consequences, as in the top floor, when the terrible truth about the fate of the inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto is not told outright, but only expressed in a suggestive suspension of Cesia's thoughts, end quote. It was supposedly a minced meatloaf. My mother hadn't done something like that for a long time. It was bad with meat in the ghetto, but anyone who is hungry tastes pretty much anything. So Cesia ate what her mother gave her. And it was so good that her family did not starve. Because, for example, Isaiah or Ariel and my grandmother complained that the supplies were running out, that there weren't even beets in the cellar, and we don't know what will happen next. End of quote. Other ghetto lacks of place, warmth, plants, animal objects, toys, books, clothes, colors, normality, even relative, are most often taught on the basis of the principle of contrast, a juxtaposition, firstly, of the past and present, and secondly, the realities of the Aryan side and the closed district, those realities to which the children's characters had access, deprived of any other point of reference. Therefore, Dorota Centrzyńska-Nogala writes about the lack of trees in the ghetto as follows, quote, it's so green here, delighted Józef, looking at plants around Basia's house from the porch roof. There are no trees left on our side. All are cut out of fuel, he cited regretfully, end of quote. In turn, Ilana Landau tells about the absence of dogs in the ghetto, quote, there were practically no dogs in the ghetto, at least Cesia did not see them, but Hans' grandmother, my father's mother, had a dachshund before the war, almost as long as a broomstick with floppy ears and short crooked legs. End quote. Elsewhere, the same author will reuse imaging by showing the difference. End quote. People were walking over the bridge. They looked different than the inhabitants of the ghetto. They were neither very elegant nor seemed happy, but they also didn't wear armbands or walk on spindly legs. They didn't lie on the pavements covered with newspapers. They moved normally. So I guess they weren't that hungry. One lady was even fat, and unbelievably, she led two dogs with bows on shaggy hands on a leash. End of quote. The last deficiency that the ghetto brings is the lack of stability. Going to the ghetto and closing it is the change for the worse. Like in Irena Sender, The Magic Beat by Beata Ostrowicka, an excerpt of which is a kind of synthetic depiction of all the representative features of the ghetto reality already discussed here. Quote, Eva is nothing like the girl she was just a few months ago. At night she dreams of rolls, butter and cake that grandma used to make every Friday. Even the milk soup she was always picky about. She doesn't remember the last time she washed when she was warm. She's scared all the time, usually has a cold, snotty. Sometimes he cries because he feels sorry for Anzan and Albina. The birds had to be left behind. End of quote. In books for older children, this contrast is presented in a more complex way, with reference to motifs known from literature for adults, such as in The Art of Time by Marcin Szczygielski, end quote. Things are very different here, a lot calmer than back in the district. People are dressed in more colorful clothes, at least the ladies are. There is less rushing around, more light, a lot more light, thought the sun shines the same. It is the people who seem to be lighter. No beggars, no one selling bread in cages. I can hear the sound of children laughing as they play in courtyards and squares. I realize that this side of the wall, children are allowed to laugh in public. End quote. At the end of this part of my consideration, I would like to return to the vision of the ghetto as a closed space. There are several possibilities to live in the ghetto, which are described in the stories analyzed here. Going to the Aryan site for a while, smuggling, and permanently hiding, or living by train. In Jurka's insomnia, it is impossible to leave the Lichtenstein ghetto. Quote, you can only get out by a German train, but nobody wants to, because then you disappear. End of quote. The ghetto as a place of adolescence and extermination. This is the last third part. Disappearance, sudden trips to distant countries, to another continent or to the countryside. This is how the death of those people closest to children is presented. In Jutka's insomnia, and quote, Mom and Dad disappeared somewhere. It is not known where. The place they went to must have been somewhere far away. Grandpa was nodding his head and saying that they had actually gone very, very far, and it is not yet known when they will come back, or whether they will come back at all. There is war after all. End of quote. In the top floor, the narrator recounts, quote, now there was neither the dog nor those grandparents. Daddy said they went to the countryside. Cesia wanted to believe it very much, end of quote. The protagonist of the Little War is long believed that the Jews of Lviv, whom she knew well, simply left. In the stories, others died, strangers, usually not people which are close to the child. Quote, if his family was killed by the Germans, just like Katolicki family, but not my family. End of quote was, and this was my question. It is similar when the author described the ghetto in general. Then there are also such sentences. Quote, those who stayed in Poland were first locked in the ghetto by the Nazis and then killed. End of quote. Only in one publication of the extensive corpus of text analyzed here, in Richard Marek Grodzkiej, the main character dies. Another exception is the ending of Wródka by Zbigniew Białas, a publication intended for older youth, based on the real diary of Rutka Jaskier, an inhabitant of the Będzin ghetto, and the memories of Zofia Mins, a prisoner of Auschwitz-Birkenau, who described the girl's death in the testimony given after the war at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. Quote, member of Sonderkommando, he looked at them. He looked at the dying girl in stripped uniform lying on the wheelbarrow a moment longer. They will burn me, and I haven't died yet. Rutka from thick eyebrows. How good that I do not feel when something is hot. But no, he will shoot me first, and only. The men from the Sonderkommando took the wheelbarrow, pulled it inside, and closed the gate behind him. The end of quote. Rutka is an exception for another reason as well. Some of the action takes place in the Auschwitz-Birkenau. However, in other Polish books for young readers, there is no place for camp experiences. If there is an extermination camp, Auschwitz-Kulmhof-Treblinka, then as a distance experience, someone else's experience, barely mentioned in the text. Transports from the Umschlagplatz depart for the camps, nobody comes back from there. The camps means death. In this perspective, the ghetto appears differently as a place from which one can leave, and the escape behind the wall usually becomes the turning point of every story. The camp is located outside the recognition area. It remains hidden. It's a kind of open secret, a secret without secret, really. On the one hand, it is known that something bad is happening in the camps, and on the other hand, it is not shown and named outright. In this regard, these lines of Jutka's insomnia are symptomatic, end quote. I have a hiding place, but they took all my family and my wife's grandfather and parents. But where did the Germans take them? Maybe it will be better for them in this new place. That's what everyone thought at first and even reported themselves. My aunt said that worse than here, it probably can be anywhere. But now people are afraid to leave. These things they said, and of course. As I mentioned, the action takes place at the crossroads and between two spaces, the ghetto and the Aryan side, and the turning point of each story is the transition to the Aryan side. The standard is helping, the standard are Poles who are helping Jews. Parents or neighbors of Polish characters help Jews in solidarity. However, there are exceptions to this rule, especially the streets that have to be crossed in order to reach the hideout on the Aryan side are dangerous. These threats are expanded in the top floor, where it is stated explicitly that every passerby could expose the main character, which is a Jew, which crystallizes in the aggressive attack that the main character experiences in the tram. And quote, come on, say something, what's your name? Probably Rivka on another Jenta, look at her, she can't even speak Polish, end of quote. This is where the nosy neighbor realizes that a Jewish girl is hiding in an apartment, and the second quote, let the lady call someone there. I will tell this plaque where it belongs, behind these walls where it was burning, and not with decent people, end of quote. And yet, snitching or blackmail, szmalcownictwo in Polish, I didn't find the word to translate szmalcownictwo, are not topics and do not appear in the pages of the works for younger children analyzed here. It can be said that it is only indicated that there are people who can recognize a Jewish child, discover a hoax. The plot that appears in all of March of Lights by Paweł Berencewicz, in my opinion, one of the best books from the corpus analyzed here, is certainly unique. Zenon Słowik, who informs the Germans where the Jews are hiding, directly and not very precisely, is called Szmarcownik. An interesting conversation is also held by Rafał from the Arc of Time. It is also meaningful that Szmarcownicy are not simply called Poles here. And quote, we didn't see any Duff boys. They often hang around by the wall. What are Duff boys? Those who try to catch people escaping from district for dough, slang for money. They strip them of everything they have. Are Duff boys Morlocks? Sort of soldiers? I thought Germans? No. But not all Morlocks speaks German and wear uniforms. Remember that. You have to be very careful. End of quote. On the other hand, images of compassion and help that Poles bring to Jews dominate. This impression is intensified by a large number of books dedicated to the life and work of Ilana Sandler. The children's protagonists of the works which are analyzed here do not deal with smuggling, which must be surprising given the scale of the phenomenon in the Warsaw Ghetto. Only Rafał from the Arc of Time thinks about smuggling. In fact, these works do not mention the ghetto uprising either. and the great liquidation action in Warsaw Ghetto too. There is no place for this event of the history of the ghetto. Adult characters try at all costs to protect children from the evil of the outside world. The scenes from the works dedicated to Janusz Korczak and the inhabitants of the orphanage have the strongest impact in this regard. The images of continuity and the rupture are also significant. The field of continuity certainly includes the struggle to maintain the appearance of normality, to enable the youngest to live a life similar to what they would have had if there had been no war. These are all activities of adults aimed at allowing children to remain children. In Jutka's Insomnia, as I have already mentioned, the grandfather of the main character feeds the birds in the ghetto during the winter when hunger rages around to maintain at least a semblance of normality, to show his granddaughter that this is what it should be done. His attitude is not understood by his family and friends. He is called Michigane, it means mad. He also teaches the girl and her friends to play hide and seek, which ultimately serves to survive, not entertainment. Children also do not have a chance for normal education. They do not go to school, neither in the ghetto nor after reaching the Aryan side. Yet they are urged to study at home and read books. In field of breaking and turn includes both the necessity to leave the ghetto, change identity and appearance, as well as learning Catholic prayers and baptism. All of this is done for the sake of the children and is intended to save them. In principle, no doubts are formulated, although, of course, the children do not want to part with their parents, do not want to dye their hair, they have difficulty remembering their new identity. Significant in this case is the objection of the character of Pepe's unfinished story, and the last quote. Isn't that a sin, that baptism? The girl had doubts. Grandma said, Grandma is dead. You are not. When life is protected, there is no sin. It is the most important thing. Besides, God is one, that explained calmly. You see, the church is nice. It's nothing. They all sing beautifully, said Lala, who did not understand the dilemmas of her new friend. What if you were to suddenly become a Jew? Rebellious Pepe asked her, and only then Lala thought about it. Ashamed, she lowered her head. End of quote. And conclusions at the end. So in time, I have a time for conclusions. Okay. Justyna Kowalska-Leder, analyzing the children's diaries of the Holocaust, wrote that, quote, it would be naive to believe that the material studied here is able to exhaust such a multivariant and multidimensional experience as growing up in the shadow of the Holocaust, end of quote. I took this sentence as a starting point. It shows, first of all, the complexity of the experience of the Holocaust, which has a fundamental impact on the possibilities of any presentation. However, in works written by children, or in the case of the text analyzed written from the perspective of a child, the cognitive horizon becomes narrow. Children do not know everything, therefore they cannot tell everything, nor do they understand everything they see. So many things remain hidden, or at least unclear for them, often also because adults do not want children to know the truth. In the works analyzed here, this recognition is crystallized in the words of parents who not want to call the war by its spelling and say the world has gone mad, or these are problems of adults. Therefore, consistent respect for children's perspective abilities must lead to certain limitations within the text and affect the represented world. Moreover, in literary communications addressed to children, there is something that can be called, unfortunately, censorship for the sake of the recipient. The child reader is not shown what makes the Holocaust a borderline experience. There is no place here for the imminent death of children, even if only the potential for death is to be seen in a given scene. A fear that is born from the awareness of the possibility of death at a time when even a child's life is constantly threatened. There are a number of particularly expressive and frightening literary images, themes, which of course have their source in the reality of the Holocaust as such. These are present in ghetto literature, images of sick, emaciated, hungry, begging, lonely children dying in the streets. They are related to the heartbreaking helplessness of parents who cannot do anything, feed, save, hug. The scenes of beating and abuses, both by the ghetto guards and Polish peers, of small smugglers, fighting hunger and keeping entire families alive, are equally frightening. This is what Adina Bladeszweiger wrote about extremely hungry children in her shocking memories, I Remember Nothing More. Quote, and on the banks there were children's skeletons or swollen lumps, and only the eyes were alive. And whoever has not seen such eyes, such a face of a starved children with a black cavity of open mouth, with wrinkled parchment skin, does not know what life can be. End of quote. The question about the borderline figurations of human subjectivity, already asked elsewhere, imposes itself here as with all force, whose, in the words which I analyze here, only some elements of the multivariant and multidimensional experience of growing up in the shadow of the Holocaust are present. However, the elements which are not present in the text analyzed here should also be considered significant, taking into account the above-mentioned possibilities, the possibilities of both the sender and the recipient of the text. This is the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for this very inspiring and engaging presentation. And for sticking to the time frame, I think we have some 10-15 minutes left for discussion.
Yes.
So we open the floor for questions from the audience here, and of course also from the people online. Who wants to break the ice? Yes, Marina, go ahead.
Okay. Well, this is the same problem that you hear me and I hear myself. Yeah.
So this is the problem with sound, yes?
Yes, it is the problem. Oh, now it's okay. No. Okay. Let us try. Thank you very much for an absolutely wonderful presentation. Is it working or is it not? Okay. My question to you is about...
Marina, just a minute. Not so loud.
Okay.
Not so loud. Stay calm. Not so loud. Would you speak? Oh. Less? Yes. Okay.
Marina, let's try once again.
Okay. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and so many illustrations of new books. You know, I have two questions. First of all, the questions that you distributed before our meeting today that are also incredibly interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with the article and the article is in English, by Dorota Michuka from Wrocław. She is talking about the ghetto space in a very using heterotopia as an opportunity to describe the relationship between the ghetto and the Aryan side. I don't remember in which Philotechnos number it was published, but I mean, it does exist, and not that I'm completely sold on this particular interpretation, but I find it very interesting. Because she looks at the ghetto not as a closed space, but she looks at ghetto as an interaction for many spaces simultaneously. So, and it is the topos that is created this way. My question is about the character, because I find it very interesting how you focused your presentation on the new figure or newer focus on the child as a character. When I was dealing with children's literature of the war, I was looking at 3 different types of child placed within the war conflict. Child as a victim, child as a helper, and return to normalcy, return to normal childhood. When I'm looking at the literature that was provided to us all by Sławomir and this whole group of Polish scholars, so I definitely find the child as a victim. I definitely find the character of it, I don't find the character of a child as a helper, except in the arc of time. If Emmet can be considered a helper because he's creating this arc in order to travel and take children outside. Have you ever seen in your experience with this literature the statements of survivors that institute the return to normalcy, to childhood as a normal space, as a space of childhood? So, or after the experience of the ghetto, or after the experience of Holocaust, this is no possibility to return to childhood as a normal space.
Okay, this is a difficult question because these books don't have the classical happy endings. So, you know, we see the child who is going to the Aryan side, and we don't know what is happening because the story ends. We saw kids with Janusz Korczak, but we don't get the information what happened. Yes, and there are also stories that the 2 time plans are mixed. So we have the past, and then we have the future. So we saw a child and then a grown person, the man or so these kids, which are Polish kids in these books, they have ordinary childhood. They go to school, for example. If when I think about the Los Utraconych of Curtis, that the first phrase that today I didn't go to school. Yesterday I didn't go to school. This is the beginning of the end of the normal childhood. But these Polish kids go to the school, so I think they have the normal childhood. But the Jewish kids, I think they don't. So this is the main difference. But I also want to say that I can agree with this researcher, Mrs. Michejka, yes? Yes, because I also think that the ghetto in the stories is an open space. The closed space is the camp, but you can't leave the camp, yes? And everything happened in the connection between ghetto and the Aryan side. And this is true.
Yeah, you can't leave the camp. You can if you are liberated, but you not by your own will, right?
But I mean in these books, yes? There is no such chance to leave the camp. You can only leave the ghetto by train, go smuggling for a moment, or leave and live on the Aryan side. These are only these three possibilities.
If I may, why do you see this is such an open ending to all those stories? Because the authors don't want to create tragedy or describe tragedy or deal with tragedy in children's literature. I mean, practically, we see our characters, I mean, we see the child characters leaving the ghetto space in the best scenario, and this is it. And we don't know anything what happens except an arc of time, right? So the question, yeah.
There was a discussion in Poland between researchers who read this text about those happy endings. And they are, this is kind of polemic. So one of them thinks that this is enough to show that some things can happen wrong, as you say. So we don't know what will happen, and that's enough, yes? And the other said that there is, we wanna help to the readers which live now, and we wanna protect them so they can see the death. And this is only for them, because this is not the truth about the Holocaust. Yes. So this is these two solutions.
Mm-hmm. But it's a kind of protective culture, Polish culture. Protective towards children, and that's why these happy endings are so common.
Yes.
Probably, because that's not the case in.
Protective culture. You use this term about Polish today's culture, or the reality presented in the novels? Because I'm interested in the same.
The one is connected with another, because of this protective culture, we have these protective happy endings in the children's books about the Holocaust.
As Sylvia said, there are no happy endings. Yes?
Of course, there are happy endings.
There are, I think that they are only happy endings.
They are only.
Yes, because there is no death in the end. And I'm asking why.
Oh yeah, I see.
Okay,
I see. There are no.
Sometimes you have open endings, but you can still have a kind of hope, which is typical for children's literature, of course.
Exactly. In this perspective, the end of the Korczak story is also open ending.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It's not a characteristic of Polish literature and
children's literature.
All
Yes, but in the Dutch literature, it's a huge difference, because you have death, you have actual material, you have these sad stories of sick and deaf children. So it's a huge difference with the Polish literature for children about the Holocaust.
there is this dark side in.
Yeah, of course.
But it's not extreme darkness.
Okay, but it's extreme light in Polish children's literature about the Holocaust, in comparison with Dutch children's literature.
Well, so what's the new in this literature? Because if we look at the whole culture after the Second World War in Poland, it seems to me that the main difference would be withdrawal of cruelty of Polish side, of Polish culture. For instance, in the 60s, it was possible for a movie, Polish movie, to show the cruelty of Polish children.
Yes.
And to show the death of Jewish kids.
Can you give
Well,
some title?
Yeah, Różewicz, nie Tadeusz, tylko Stanisław.
Yes.
Film.
So we have examples in 60s
Yeah.
for it.
Well, there are lots of. It was kind of a normalcy. I can remember.
But I think that this situation, this kind of film, were not for children, but for adults. But we are talking about the literature, which are for children and for young adults.
Okay.
And this is difference between them. But I would like to say about this Jewish death a short word. Many years ago, very famous Polish Jewish writer Henryk Grimberg wrote about it that in Polish culture Jews don't dead. Jews disappeared. Why? Because Poles don't want to look at the Jewish dead. Because this is very uncomfortable to see the truth about Jewish faith. And he wrote about it from the position of the child of the Holocaust. And he wrote about it. I don't remember any talking about Jewish death during the Holocaust and after Holocaust. I only remember that people said, oh, some Jews disappeared.
Sławek, but don't you think that we try to protect children? We can't show the truth, but in reality, the truth is we protect ourselves. I think this is something weird, but because I don't understand why we can't say to kids, you know, there was the death in the end of the Holocaust. This is the main thing in Holocaust. That yes.
Yes.
But it's
Annihilation.
This protective culture, it's not only about Holocaust, it's about everything towards children. When you think about the discussion a few years ago about children who had to go to school at the age of 6 instead of at the age of 7, which was normally till then in Poland. And there was a big discussion and tried to let them go to school at the age of 6, but at the end they go to school at the age of 7 again. So because they were found too young to go to school. So this protective culture, it's everywhere again towards or against children actually. And you see it also in this literature on the Holocaust for children.
Because I want to show you that from the reality of the Holocaust, this author picked up only some elements and put it to this text. And I'm wondering why exactly those elements, but not the other ones. Why, for example, we can say that Irena Sendler rescued kids, but we can say that it was extremely traumatic for them. Yes, because they have to leave their families. We can say that she was a hero, but we can also say that those kids have a huge problem. Yes, they often didn't know who they are. Yeah? If they are Jews or if they are Poles, and so I'm wondering why we don't write about young smugglers. Yes, why it's a problem? I don't know.
Yeah, if I may jump in, because we are dealing with consumer culture. We're dealing with the culture of consumerism, because those books they are not only written, they have to be sold.
Yes, that's why I was talking about the market at the beginning.
Exactly. I mean, this is the market, and what parents are going to buy books that are going to undermine culture, that are going to undermine this protective shell. So, and this is why we all have to believe these half-truths.
Yes, and I agree, because it's also the question of so in the reception of Dutch literature translated in Polish, you can read some passages of adults and parents who write, "I wouldn't buy this book for my child." It was about a book of everything, very nice and prominent book by that writer, and it was translated in Polish, and many parents, I read the reactions of the parents on the internet, and they said, "I wouldn't buy this book for my child because it's too heavy, it's too hard." And it was about religion, it was about child abuse, so about father who beats his son, which is in Poland a huge problem, but we don't like to know that this is a problem. So, and we don't like read this kind of books, and I think maybe this is the same could be said about children's literature on the Holocaust, just like Sławek said. We don't like to look at uncomfortable things, because it's our daily life, and literature is for the huge amount of people a place to escape and not to read about everyday life, which is very disturbing.
But why do parents don't want to buy novels for their children about Holocaust, but they buy books about wolf who ate baby and her grandpa, and there is no problem with it, with the man who cooked soup with two children inside, and that is normal. This is literature for children.
But it's a fairy tale, so it's not true.
Yes, it's not true.
There is a shield of convention.
Yeah.
But I think that is
normal
problem.
Well, yeah. You said, both of you said something about comfort. It is, of course, a very important thing. Culture and society cannot exist without zones of comfort. We are not able to live in social area if it was uncomfortable. But maybe it's a question, maybe what we see in Polish culture, or maybe in all post-Holocaust cultures, first, it's blurring the definition of child and perspective of child, because everything what has happened in ghetto and during the Holocaust was destroyable for the childhood. If we took into consideration books written by Henryk Grünberg, Michał Głowiński, Bogdan Wojdowski, Brat rzucony umarłym.
Co tam się dzieje przecież, nie?
So what we see in the next decades, it's narrowing the definition of a child.
Yes.
So this is a change of.
Yes.
So
I think so.
maybe the cornerstone of your story is creating a child as a person who cannot receive the death or perceive the death. Yeah?
I think that we should remember about the suspicious reading. I'm very suspicious when I'm reading these books because I think that they have value because they are about the Holocaust. You know, not we read them and we know they are about Holocaust, so they have value.
Double criteria.
I'd like to ask all of you, what would you expect from Holocaust literature for children? At what age can we tell them about the utmost evil in them? What is the use of that? What is the pedagogical approach of that? So it's a very open question, and I don't have the answer. But it is really, can you tell a 4-year-old, well, there was a time that,
I think children are more, or they can handle more than we can credit for often. If you explain it in such a way that a 4-year-old can
Yes, the way.
and about police cruelty committed to children, I don't know. I fear I would be having approaches to parents who told me I wouldn't buy a book for my children.
Yeah, but it's very unstable. For instance, in Polish culture, but it seems to me that in all European or world cultures, that in Polish culture we do have lots of examples and lots of stories, not from the fairy tales store magazine, but from Polish history, which emphasize cruelty because it was cruelty against the Poles. So Polish history, I mean the education of history in elementary school is full of stories about heroism, death, fight and blood and battlefields. And it's quite normal to say children 100 people were killed or gassed or burnt or well hanged up. It's quite normal. But the problem is when the death were the Jews.
Professor Czaplinski, I think, and sorry, I think I have an answer to this question. I thought about it a few moments here. It's not kind of reason that I made, but I think it has. This is because the role of the dead, is saved for the sacred.
But Jew is dead or
no, the dead is sacred person.
For Polish people, yes?
To the sacred one, to Christ, the death is the way of sacralization. This is the way of martyr. Not everyone can die here. Yeah, the death is the way of heroism, and someone perhaps don't deserve to be dead.
Yeah. So they disappear.
Yes, but kids in Warsaw Uprising can be dead.
Of course.
It's heroic, it's monumental. Let's make a monument of small. Yes.
Yeah. We've been taught in the very first class of the elementary school how many soldiers were killed on Westerplatte. Yes.
How many
because
kids?
I think that there is beautiful Polish death and very ugly and sad Jewish death.
Like from
That's-
Auschwitz, like from Hannah's Prague.
And that's the standpoint against which Marek Edelman talked with Hamaka. Right against this standpoint that there is aesthetic and non-aesthetic death, black and white.
But okay, we are talking here about children's literature, and I don't know that good Polish children's literature, but say me about Polish children's books where the death of Polish children is shown. I can't remember from my childhood and my readings this kind of books as well. So maybe it's not only the Jewish death in in Polish children's books, but the death.
This is a good question.
Because we are talking about children's literature, not about Polish culture in general. So I'm interested in this ways of showing things about Holocaust, but also other things in children's literature. So
There is a book, only I can recall only one, but this is not the Polish book. This is Chłopcy z Placu Broni. And the Meczek is the character who dies in the end. I don't know if I remember well, but this is also symptomatic. This is not Polish book, but this is the reading in school even now. So.
Chris, Marina, Paulina wants to.
Yeah, well,
Marina, listen to.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I do.
I'm your advocate. I noticed that you want to say something.
Thank you. Yeah, because this is a troubling question for me. You see, what is happening right now, and we, as literary critics, serve this half-truth. And it happens not only with the Holocaust literature, children's literature about Holocaust. It happens, for example, in the literature that I'm working with, in Russian literature, when we started to talk and write about Great Terror, Stalinism, and Gulag. It is right now, it's emerging children's literature about this particular period. But we accept half-truth in order to keep this issue, this historical tragedy alive. And within the realm of our discussion, we accept that it is no death, we accept that main characters survive, we accept so many half-truths in order to keep the topic, the theme, the historical event alive within the realm of children's literature. And my question, the big question is, are we doing disservice to the next generation? Or this is the only way to function, to act, to write, to educate?
Powiem to po polsku, bo będzie mi łatwiej, ale za chwilę może powiem po angielsku. Wiesz co, to jest dobre pytanie, ale ono jest też niedobre. Nie, twoje, wiesz dlaczego? Bo skoro jest tak, jak ty mówisz, że w innych książkach dzieci nie umierają i w tych też nie, to Holokaust nie jest niczym innym niż zwykłą przygodą. Jak każda inna. Wiesz, trzeba by sprawdzić, czy są książki na przykład dla dzieci o Powstaniu Warszawskim i czy dzieci tam umierają, nie? Ale jak... Yes, of course.
The question, because the question of Marina was very interesting. Is this kind of showing of Holocaust the only way to keep it alive in the memory of?
I think this is the way to kill the memory, not to keep this memory about Holocaust alive. We can't do something like this that we are lying about it. Maria Janion wrote that about the Schindler's I can't remember how to say kitsch in English.
It's kitsch.
So this is kitsch, yes? And I think because I think that we should write the truth. Kids like the truth. They should get the truth. So give them the truth. Don't make Holocaust one more historical adventure, one more historical event. Show them that this is unique and exceptional.
Yes, but the children's books are not bought by children, but by parents.
Yes, that's true.
And that's the problem.
Well, so sure. Well, maybe we shouldn't focus so much and so eagerly on death, because maybe one of the questions connected with your story is, and that's the reason why it is so hard, so difficult to narrate this story, is the problem why they were so isolated. Why they were so departed from all the rest of society. How did it happen that the ghetto was created, and so on and so on. So it's a problem of solitude, of loneliness, and maybe this is the question more important than or equally important than death.
Okay, time is running, so thank you very much once
Thank
again to Sylvia.
Thank you.
And we will
Thank
now
you.
give the floor and the screen to the speaker's moment of this seminar, Professor Żurek, who doesn't need to be presented because we know him.
I wanted to say that I wanted to say that we should start from some warm words from Chris to me about myself, but he did it himself. The title of my lecture is 21st Century Polish Literature and the Genre, from history to artifacts. And the first part is Polish memory of the history of the Holocaust. It is of the shock. I think this is very important to understand it. Okay, moment. Okay. In the Nazi-occupied Poland, Second World War was a human catastrophe. Its victims were both Poles and Jews, but situation of these two groups under the Nazi regime was diametrically different. Poles lost about 3 million people, which amounts to about 10% of the nation from before the war. Of the 6 million Jews who died in the years 1939-1945, of their 3 million were Polish citizens, or about 90% of all Jews that inhabited the country before the war. Poles were being killed mainly because they actively or passively resisted the invader. Jews were being killed because they were Jews. However, after the war, Polish people felt they were harmed more than Jews. They felt they had been abandoned in the early stages of the war and betrayed in the Yalta Treaty of 1945. It was agreed that the Polish state was to be in the Soviet area of influence. Many Poles did not accept that and in various ways opposed the state authorities dependent on the USSR. At the same time, the post-war Poland was suffering from all kinds of ills and trying to find a scapegoat channeled its anger and frustration at the Jewish survivors of the shock. This was because communism was associated with Jews already in the pre-war press. Indeed, among the authorities of the post-war Polish People's Republic and its security forces, there were communists of Jewish origin, mainly those who had served under the General Zygmunt Berlin during the war. But they were few in number. However, the odium and the contemptuous name Żydokomuna, Jewish communist, affected everything Jewish. On the one hand, acts of cruelty were indeed perpetrated by some Arendt Party activists. On the other hand, the image of ordinary Jews as culprits responsible for all the wrongs that befell real Poles is a stereotype and arose during the Polish Bolshevik War of 1920-1921. This also explains to some extent why in certain cycles the shock was perceived as a punishment for the alleged eternal anti-Polonism and anti-Christianity as a form of revenge on Jews right through German hands. These views might have also served as a convenient excuse for the plunder of the possessions of Holocaust victims, the taking over their houses, and the post-war pogroms in Krakow and in Kielce. Of those who miraculously avoided extermination and tried suffering from the trauma to continue living in their decimated families. Even today, one can find Poles affected by an obsessive fear of possible material claims from the descendants of those killed in the shock. After the eventually political victory of the communists in 1947, thanks to falsified referendum and parliamentary elections, and the emergency of the Polish United Workers' Party in 1948, the shock was clouded with a veil of silence. It simply did not fit the image of the Polish People's Republic as a country born thanks to military effort of the Soviet army, and one where democracy, as the propaganda of the time would have it, came as end of the historical justice. Jews and their annihilation had no role to play in the Marxist dialogue. The Jewish tragedy was absent from the communist narrative of the victory over the Nazi and the cruelty of the Second World War. After the war, the first wave of illegal Jewish emigration to Israel took place and gained momentum directly after the emergence of the State of Israel in 1948. However, it ended in early 50s, along with the Stalinist terror of the time. With the Stalinist era over and Władysław Gomułka in power, The second wave of the Jewish exodus began 1956-1959. Although the world was preoccupied with the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Poland, the extermination of Jews still remained beyond public discussion. Even if individual literary works devoted to the Holocaust were being published, usually in limited circulation, the critics would always interpret them in a broader context. Exceptions did occur, such as the prose of Stanach Grodzkiej or the debuts of the children of the Holocaust generation, for example, Henryk Grimberg and Bogdan Wojdowski, whose Jewishness could not be downplayed, but in no way did they reach broader readership. In some social cycles, usually among the anti-communism intelligentsia, Israel's victories in the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War were greeted with enthusiasm, as they were also defeat of the Soviets, who turned out to be linked with Arab states in the political and military sense. At state level, the Six-Day War brought about a Soviet-forced disruption of Polish-Israeli diplomatic relationships and anti-Semitic witch hunt that in turn led to the tragic events of March 1968 and the final Aliyah from Poland. In the years 1968-1972, the final contingent of Polish Jews left the country. Paradoxically, as a reaction to the demagogy of the communist propaganda, Poles continued, in the broad social sense, to consider themselves victims of Jewish communists. The Shoah, as a Jewish tragedy, was still tabooed and remained outside social concessions. In 1978, a major breakthrough came with the pontificate of Pope John Paul II, and soon afterwards with the emergency of the Independent Solidarity trade union in 1980. On numerous occasions, the Pope would refer to his pre-war contacts with the Jewish community, underscore the calamity of Shoah, lament the loneliness and underserved suffering. He referred to Jews following the Polish 19th century poet Adam Mickiewicz as elder brothers in faith, an expression that entered the language of Catholic discourse. Most importantly, the Pope emphasized the historical and cultural gravity of the Holocaust. For example, he paid tribute to the Jewish victims in Auschwitz, praying in front of the flag commemorating them. The Shoah also began to be discussed in the Polish underground publications that emerged after 1976. As a result, Jews and the Holocaust entered public discourse for good. In the late 90s, the basically moribund communist regime established diplomatic ties with Israel, but serious Polish-Jewish relation accompanied with the restoration of the memory of the Holocaust and its significance only seriously began after the collapse of the political system and the elections of 1989. The Holocaust, as one can see, was for a long time under the informal taboo. If at all, the Shoah was treated as one of many German war crimes. As an example of this policy of silencing and generalization, consider the memorial plaque at Auschwitz devoted to all the nations that fell victims to the Nazi regime. They were mentioned in alphabetic order, so that Jews, Polish Żydzi, were mentioned as the last. Even thought Jewish victims were the most numerous. The letter Ż, like Żurek also, closes the Polish alphabet. The plaque stayed in place until mid-90s. The media downplayed the Jewish tragedy by saying that for Poles and other nations, especially for Russians, this was also a time of suffering. The authorities claimed that around 6 million Poles lost their lives during the war, but failed to add that over half of them were Polish Jews, as if Jewishness had never been an issue in Polish society. Murdered precisely because of their ethnicity. In the official discourse, there was no mention of death camps built especially for Jews, or of the numerous ghettos all over the country. When Arab states lost the Six-Day War, the official communist media portrayed Israel as an aggressor. Its military campaign was described with the language used earlier to refer to Nazi war actions. References to the Shoah initiated in the underground press during the so-called Solidarity Revolution gained momentum in the years 1985-1987. First, thanks to the screening of Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah, albeit in a censored version, and then after the publication in the weekly Tygodnik Powszechny of Jan Błoński's essay, which was mentioned by Professor Przemysław.
Professor Przemysław.
That's all right. Oh, Chapliński! Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Biedni Polacy patrzą na ghetto. Poor Poles look at the ghetto. Polish attitudes and reactions to the Holocaust began to be discussed. The topic re-entered public discourse after the publication in 2000 of Jan Tomasz Gross's book Sąsiedzi, Neighbors, which deals with the events in the village of Jedwabne, where in 1941 the Polish inhabitants forced the Jews from the village into the burn and burned them alive. The second part, the struggle for the memory of the Shoah in the Polish literature of the 21st century. Beginning with the second half of the 80s, the Polish memory of the Shoah was being rebuilt thanks to publication of the Children of the Holocaust, both memoirs and literary works. The last surviving witnesses of these events, they really always wrote about the Shoah from the Jewish perspective, making ample use of their own experiences, accounts of family members, and historical record. The first two works about the Shoah by authors of the second generation are Paweł Hiles, born 1957, Weiser Davide, and Piotr Szewcz Zagłada, The Annihilation. Both novels make an attempt to review the Jewish world in the context of a little homeland. Both deal with the Shoah by sketching it subtly in the background. One can say with some with some simplification, that the year 2000 marks the beginning of a struggle in Polish literature, struggle for the memory of the Shoah and its significance for new generations of Poles. Post-2000 literature that deals with these themes is written mainly by the authors born in 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. Those post-memorial reconstructions try to answer two fundamental anthropological questions. Who are the Jewish victims of the Shoah for Poles? Who are? And how do Poles view themselves in this context? Polish-Jewish relationships in the context of the Shoah is marked in post-2000 literature by a tension that allows one to discover the gravity and significance of the Holocaust, as well as the enduring presence of its consequences in contemporary Poland. Who are Jews after Shoah? According to Nazi law, or lawlessness, Jews who had been decided for extermination as a nation as representatives of the so-called Semitic race became dead already when alive. The mere fact of being a Jew meant a death sentence. Many photographs of the period, especially in camp documents and from the final stages of the functioning of ghettos, show emaciated living human skeletons that have become iconic representations of the Jews during the Holocaust. You can see this icon on the right-hand side part of the screen. Another image of Jews common in Polish mentality are the ashes. Ashes. Jews are ashes. That symbolize that, but also ashes in the literal sense, as in the case at Majdanek concentration camp in Lublin, now a mausoleum. Jewish remains in Poland do not only rest in tombs, they are everywhere. Jews in Poland are everywhere, in the foundations of the stadiums, in playgrounds, recreation areas, buildings. They are even in the building material used for their construction. Execution and extermination sites of Polish Jews were omnipresent. In recent literary works, Jews are also the ghettos from a ghost from another world, with whom Poles try to make contact. Finally, some Polish authors of the second and third generation slowly discover that the multi-million strong mass of the Holocaust victims is composed of actual people with their family histories, private lives, feelings, fascinations, and fears. Jews as living dead. In Igor Ostachowicz novel, Noc Żywych Żydów, Night of the Living Jews, the main protagonist is an educated blue-collar worker living in an apartment block in Warsaw district of Muranów, located on the site of the Warsaw Second World War ghetto. He discovers one day that in his cellar there are Jews who have probably lived there since the war. They are referred to in the novel as the living dead, the Jewish zombie, creatures, ghosts, Jewish specters, the true corpses, etc. They are many Also, at the beginning, one can only hear what? An occasional scraping sound and the cracking of the stretching bones. The protagonist soon realized that these dead bodies wandering around Muranow's underground are all in sense wretches, as nearly all normal ones went to heaven long ago. They have been traumatized by the Shoah so much that after 60 years they are still shocked and cannot pull themselves together. Some feel offended by that, cannot see any sense in what they experience, and are afraid that we'll have to forgive. Some are also traitors, having worked for the police or the Sonderkommando. The protagonist of the novel is initially afraid of this Jewish dead, and when he has to face them, he virtually panics. These figures are horror-like. Their eye sockets are empty. Stamped tones stick out of their mouths. They are dirty and stink. Some lack parts of their faces or their limbs. They are wearing worn-out clothes from before the war. Yet they decided to go out and merge into the cities. This happens not only in Warsaw, but all over the country, with the living dead coming out of ditches or from under railway embankments and going to the nearby towns to tell stories of their suffering, have some tea, a biscuit, or a buttered challah. This grotesque vision makes the reader realize the gravity of the problem. In order to get rid of these Jews from Poland, once and for all, one must exterminate them again, as they are generally considered a treat. As before, also today, what? The Jewish ghost spreads desires, and once they arrive, little children began to disappear in Warsaw. One must therefore kill the Jewish corpses that impersonate the memory of the Jews, so that they will disappear from the past, present, and future. Bożena Heft in Utwór o Matce i Ojczyźnie, Work About Mother and Homeland, tries to reconstruct this mechanism of thinking about the Jewish dead. What? Jews apparently dead, but in fact they always alive, are so powerful that they reproduce even when dead. This irrational haze of anti-Semitism in relation to the Jewish dead is audible from time to time, but is not always captured by those whom it doesn't concern. Jews are ashes. In work about Mother and Homeland, Kev writes that there is a growing awareness in Poland of the enormous amount of ashes of exterminated Jews. What? City, districts, churches, and apartment blocks are built on the remains they bones. The city of Warsaw stands on Jewish ashes. Such construction practices took place especially in the Warsaw graveyard-like district of Muranów, located on the site of the Second World War Jewish ghetto. Therefore, many contemporary Polish books are set in their location. For example, Bożena Chomontowska, stacja Muranów Station. In this district, wrote Chomontkowska, places left after the destroyed building, squares and streets, were quickly and unproblematically taken over by the new architecture. Sometimes a deeper layer lurks from underneath the surface. Blocks, like apartment blocks in Anielewicz Street, look like the prisoner barracks from the camp that stood there. The empty square in the middle of the district is a disturbing sight, like an open wound. The non-existent Jewish district is an open wound, full of remains of its former inhabitants, a real and symbolic cemetery. Directly after the war, it was only ruins, 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 ruins. Debris, sometimes 5 feet high. Today, you can only recognize the former Jewish districts thanks to monuments. Its contemporary layout reveals emptiness and absence. Not many knows that remains of the former Jewish city are still there. What? In the words of Włodzimierz Holsztyński, an emigre of March 1968, the author of a poem about Muranów, in these debris there were bodies and bones. They were mixed with everything else. No one after the war was meticulous about it. There were no conditions for it, or at least no one saw it that way. This is from an online discussion. With time, the boundary between the former Jewish residential district with a cemetery within, its limits, and the surrounding Aryan districts became obliterated. A Warsaw architect and the town planner, Józef Sigali, says in the collection of thoughts, notes and memories titled Nad Wisłą staje warszawski dzień, a new Warsaw day over the Vistula, what? The cemetery walls seem redundant. They no longer divide the two words. Quoted by Chomontkowska in Stacja Muranów. The construction of the old district after the war in record time on a shallow platform of debris may result in the foundation of buildings yielding to the pressure of walls glued from brick fragments and erected hastily from the material ready to use in the location of the ghetto. Pre-war inhabitants of Muranów and the Jews who were watered there by Nazis, what, are still waiting, buried in the cellars for the end of the war. For the time being, they are sleeping. Chomontkowska repeats after the writer Sylwia Hutnik that contemporary Warsaw holds the Jewish ashes within itself. Today, what? Today, one lives in Muranów with the ghetto people. The bricks that were made on the site contained not only fragments of building, but everything that was there, including human remains. All that, crushed and pulverized, served as the building material. Jews are hungry ghosts. Muranów is a place married with tragedy, a place of horror. What? From Sylwia Hutnik. Its ghosts, failing bricks, nightmares, stories oozing out of the mounds of the staircases. It is Jewish specters wailing, burned to death, sitting underground since 1946. Today's anti-Semitic view is that there are treasures that they left in the cellars. Or even that, even if the Jews are all dead, they are still sitting on their possessions. Jews are viewed as a constant threat. Their ghosts are like skeleton dragons and breathe harshly and wag their tails. In Hutnik's grotesque vision, Polish ghosts wander about Muranów as well and interact with the Jewish ones. This is how it is done by the Polish children, victims of the Warsaw Uprising, also affected by anti-Judaistic prejudices. What? Listen, it's very interesting. They suddenly remembered the vision of the matzah made of their own bodies. So they quickly began to crumble their fingers, hands, noses, scatter the crumbs around them, and call the Jews like they were calling chickens. Jews! Jews! Muranu! They heard murmurs, smacking of the lips, scattering of the food in all directions. The hungry ghosts ate the children with relish. As well, said the children aloud, go on eating. We will lend you our bodies, we will share our bodies. They knew they had to win the graces of the unknown demons somehow. They also knew they could not turn back. Not now. The dragon is awake. The dragon won't stop eating. End of quote. Jews are still everywhere in Poland, but that the conviction of their omnipresence stays with the protagonist of Marka Masada novel Święto Trąbek, Rosh Hashanah, who says, while looking at the landscape around her, they are here all the time, said protagonist. Their bodies reinforce this embankment. Jews are people. The whole mechanism of propaganda, both anti-Judaistic, which attributes to the Jews the role of Judas, the traitor, the killer of God, and that of a demon, and anti-Semitic, which denies Jews the stature of humans, was very much present among Poles during the Shoah, and later. In Anna Bolecka's novel Cadyk I Dziewczyna, The Tzaddik and the Girl, the main protagonist, a Polish Jew, subject to the reception of the Nazi anthropological manipulation to profound reflection. Quote, the Jew, a powerful creature that plans a disaster for humanity, somewhat not totally human, a demonic and inconceivable creature. It is possible for her and educated and thinking persons to succumb to such prejudice? Those who survived the Holocaust, like the mother of the main protagonist of Monika Rakusa's novel 1939,9, know that a Jew who wants to continue living in Poland will be safer with Aryan documents. Never, quote, never disclose your origin, says the Jewish mother to her daughter born after the war. They are all anti-Semitic here, and sooner or later will use it against you. On the other hand, if people do learn about one's Jewish identity, it is nothing to be ashamed of, but also nothing to boast about. Jewishness, says the mother in the book, can be lived somehow, but certainly not in the sense of belonging to Jewish culture. Quote, "No one spoke Yiddish in our home. We have nothing to do with them. Your grandpa never acted Jewish, maybe except when he told Jewish jokes." To Judaism, what? We have nothing to do with this religion or links with Israel. Post-war Jews should constantly strengthen their self-esteem by recalling past episodes. For example, what? Before the war, your grandparents were friends with Scamander. You know who was the members of Scamander, very known Polish literary group. What? Your grandpa was a real lady, not a Jewish housekeeper. Your grandparents spoke Polish better than most Poles. Your grandpa knew the Old Słowacki by heart. In Mariusz Sieniewicz, grotesk short story Żydówek nie obsługujemy, Jewish women are not served, a Polish middle-aged man, when doing his shopping, suddenly begins to perceive as a Jewish woman. We are dealing here with a peculiar anthropological construction. What? You are a person taken away from a man and returned to a Jewish woman, says the narrator. Her presence evokes aggression among other customers than anti-Semitic behavior, and it all ends in pogrom. Fuller, black humor, and other form of expression seemingly distant from any kind of revisionism and decide to provoke the idea that only way for Poles to regain their own humanity after the shock is to discover the Jew in themselves. Zula, the protagonist of Masada's Świętotrąbek, Rosh Hashanah, is a grown-up Polish woman raised by her grandfather, an ex-prisoner of a concentration camp, who used to tell her stories of the war and the Nazi terror since she was little. The Jewish nation becomes entrenched in Zula's mentality to the extent of becoming part of her ego. She decided to do something for the nation other than cultivating its memory. She is obsessed as a woman with desire to compensate the Jewish community for the children who were killed or could not be born, and so decides to give birth to them. However, according to the religious law, a Jewish child can only be born of a Jewish woman. Zula becomes one in most unusual circumstances. During a business trip to the United States, on a Friday night, as she walks through the street of the Hasidic district of Borough Park in New York City, she meets an old Jew who starts shouting to her, Gilgul Neshamot, Gilgul Yo, the book in your white body, Jewish soul in your body, the book arrived in Ayer Weißen Guf, a Yiddische Neshome in Ayer Guf. By using a mixture of Yiddish and English, the man diagnoses in Zola's body the book of a Jewish woman murdered in the Holocaust. Guilty in a rather peculiar and unclear way of failing to pass on life to the next generation. Her redemption can only happen through Zula's body. Quote, I can now clear feel I'm possessed by a spirit that tells me to love Jewish men and give birth to their lost children. This is Torah's most fundamental order. Be fruitful and multiply. In Piotr Paziński's novel, Pensjonat, boarding house, Jews are mostly dead people, reconstructed in the narrator's memory and brought to life in the novel. They figure in pictures that the protagonist narrator looks through. They are more than a collection of data about pre-war Polish Jewry. They are concrete people, each representing a different worldview. Chaim is Zionist, Abraham is an advocate of assimilation, Leon is a communist, while Jacob is very religious. They are shown in the novel in interaction in a perennial Jewish debate and are linked by trying to relate to the Shoah. For Chaim, the only alternative that the Jews have in the world married with the Shoah is Zionism. Abraham lost his entire family in the Holocaust. The only survivors are his son and him, who stayed in Poland because, quoted, someone must look after the bones. Someone must look after the bones. Abraham reconstructs the Polish world. He writes a, biographical lexicon of all Jews who ever lived in Poland, but finds it impossible to cope with the text. Leon, the communist, argues with everyone about the status of the Jewish world in a post-Shoah Poland. But this is futile because in the Poland after the Shoah, that world is gone. Finally, Jacob, proficient in Orthodox Judaism, reconstructs Talmudic discourses by studying a fragment of the Torah. He is unaccompanied in the task and so cannot fulfill the requirements of the method employed in yeshiva. Quote, it is better to study in Tus. They say the Shekinah is more likely to come, or two heads are better than one. By poring over the Torah and the Talmud after the Shoah, Jacob tries to wrestle with God like the biblical Jacob. However, what he meets is not God, but an empty space. The nothingness that was left in Poland when God and the Jews are gone. Jacob is a tragic figure. He knows that his reading of the Torah and its Talmudic interpretation may be a form of restitution of the Jewish world. That meditation over a single page of the Talmud may save the whole world, but at the same time he realizes that conducting these studies in post-war Poland is simply no longer possible. All the characters in Paziński's book are constructed in order to find out if the existence of the Jewish world in the post-Shoah Poland makes sense. This multitude of, images creates an illusion of memory, and similarly to the multitude of the photographs becomes an ersatz of life. Another book that presents Jews as concrete people rather than anonymous mass is Magdalena Tuli's Flow. in the book the reality of the Holocaust, metonymy. Excuse me?
No.
No. But my professor at Jagiellonian University told me, Professor Polski, that the worst thing in the world is a writer alive. In the book, the reality of the Holocaust metonymically enters the present time. Unexpected guests arrive in a small town, similarly to Jews who used to be brought to the ghettos from abroad. What?
No.
And now the tram stops, and the first refugees appear in the square.
Refugees.
Refugees can.
It's about refugees.
A few dark figures of different ages in thick winter coats, ear-flapped hats, with kerchiefs, scarves, gloves. They treat uncertainly, bewildered by the sudden collapse of their faith. Those people cannot rent apartment anywhere, so they crowd in the square as more and more tram transports arrive. Town authorities issue regulation concerning temporary solutions to the problem. These concern pedestrian traffic. The newcomers are not allowed to cross the tram line, and the location of the intruders make them move from one place to another with their luggage, or if necessary, without it. The final solution, it is what? Reports the narrator did not call for any special measures of then blocking a few ventilation shafts in the bunker, and then the more used to line. Eventually, the problem was solved, the foreign body was removed, and the primeval state from before the arrival of the refugees was restored. This ironic take on the situation resembles the stereotypical anti-Semitic thinking and attitudes.
What?
Anti-Semitic thinking and attitudes. Listen. From Magdalena, having introduced so violently in the very middle of the town's familiar space, to limit it and not rich enough to hold everyone, they were eventually excluded from it, removed from sight once and for all, what a relief to the inhabitants. This association, also activists at various levels, the contemporary attitude to the stranger's others. The transfiguration being described allows the reader to realize the still active mechanism of hostility. Jews are concrete living people with names also figures in Piotr Szewcz's debut novel Zagłada. However, their existence is limited to the world from before the Shoah. The story takes place in a pre-war Polish Jewish town, still unaffected by the Holocaust, but already under the ominous influence of the coming eschatological hecatomb. What? Somewhere in the distance, in the north, a storm is ready. But the inhabitants of our town know nothing about it. What tomorrow will bring, no one can tell. Today the storm is in our course. The inhabitants are Herschel Blum, the owner of a textile store with his wife Zelda Blum, his children and other people living in Listopadowa Street in Zamość, now southeastern Poland, the Hasids and other Jewish patrons of the Inn Podroga. And the last change Poles among the nations of the world. In the case of Judaistic topoi, two interconnected tropes can be identified in the perceiving non-Jews, the unrights persons, enemies, and the righteous persons, friends. Poles as the unright house among the nations of the world. The first image of the enemy in contemporary Polish accounts of the Shoah comes with a demonic creation. These are the anti-Semitic beasts from Ostachowicz Nights of the Living Jews. In The Devil, with a clandestine code name KZ, Ktoś Zły, the Evil One, and ZZ, Zupełnie Zły, Total Evil, that wants to effect, what? The final solution to the problem of wandering corpses by provoking the outbreak of the Night of the Living Jews, a Jewish uprising that will have to be brutally suppressed. The dead will have to be killed again, this time for good, and so removed from Polish memory. The anti-Semitism of the Evil One can be seen in what he says, for example, quote, "What is the most offensive term of abuse? Cryptic communists? Cryptic gays? I got it. It's cryptic Jews. That's it. This is my path to power. I must unmask and expose these Jewish corpses." End of quote. This kind of anti-Semitism is a political program. Therefore, in anti-Jewish actions, demons, the evil one and the totally evil, cooperate with Warsaw neo-Nazis and the average inhabitants of the city that support them. The battle between the Jewish corpses and the anti-Semitic enemies is in the shopping mall Arcadia is the fact a symbolic battle for the memory of the Shoah. Aż się boję.
Że co, to o zwierzętach też jest o Żydach?
In włoskie szpilki, Italian High Hills, Magdalena Tully shows the anti-Semitism affects even Polish children. In conversations with them in March 1968, one hears that, quote, "bad people hide in Poland, that they want to betray our country, sell it to our enemies and take all the money. Jews are slave foxes that hide their mean intentions. The protagonist narrator is associated by her school friends for money, and one of them unabashedly says, 'Your family must all be burned. Your mother first of all.' Poles keep reminding their Jewish neighbors, quote, 'You eat our bread.' Similarly, in Tully's other novel, Hum, the protagonist discovers her Jewish identity and begins to think, 'Who am I? Someone that nobody likes, someone unlikable.'"
It's not because of the Jewish origin.
Okay, but
They just don't like her.
we will discuss it. Okay. In Christian Piwowarski's novel Więcej gazu, kameraden, more gas, kameraden, we see how Polish peasants argue about the Jewish possessions that they are stealing. Although all Jews in the town were first deported and then murdered, the peasants still think Jews are always lucky, always find a way out, even out of the Holocaust. For example, after the airstrike on the town of Wieluń, there is a lone survivor from a ruined tenement house, a Jewish lawyer called Roman, referred to us as a little Jew or scoundrel. This is interpreted as a historical injustice. The whole family have died, but he escaped unscathed. No stone unturned, and Romek just shot off the dust and put his head back on. This kind of reasoning goes deeper. Romek's survival is viewed as a precedent, God's error, and God certainly supports the Holocaust if one looks at what is going on. What? Would the Germans have killed so many Jews if God hadn't agreed? Monika Rakusa, in her mentioned novel 39,9, paints an ironic and grotesque picture of anti-Semitism which can be found even in her own Jewish ancestors. How could one live as a Jew in pre-war Poland? First of all, one had, quote, to cut the sidewalks and distance oneself from all Orthodox. Change one's name to European one. Make a lot of money and master a few languages, at least as well as Yiddish, which it was good to actually forget. And of course, baptize one children. Now it means after Shoah, one can only be an eminent Jew. What? From a respectable family or club. One has to repudiate the policy of the Israel all the time and uphold the memory of the Holocaust. This is grotesque vision, and yet the protagonist assumes Jewish identity because being a Jew means being an intellectual, which gives one a chance to escape the emptiness of apartment block districts and live in the world of great values. These novels clearly suggest that the Polish society is full of radical anti-Semitism whose advocates are always ready to act and who can count on others for support. People of other views are also there, but the proportions can be overwhelming. Poles are the right house among the nation of the world. Of course, in Polish literature, you can know about it. This is connected with the historical policy of our new government. There are a lot of vision of Poles who are right house among the nation of the world. But I would like to focus on one very interesting vision. The other important Judaistic trope in Polish 21st literature is the figure of the right house people. Who are the right house people? How are they portrayed in Polish literature? One of them is the narrator protagonist in Night of the Living Jews, an intellectual who does manual work, previously cherishing anti-Semitic views, who surprisingly, especially to him, becomes the leader and savior of the Jewish zombie. At first, he treats this whole matter with a panic of salt and calls himself the helper of Jewish corpses. He goes down to the cellar several times and realizes, this is silly, but I feel at ease there. I need some gunners who greet me, pat me on the back, shake my hands. I found some company for myself. Much later, he says with horror, like I am a fucking defender of Jews. What a shame. The turning point comes with a vision he has of being transported to Auschwitz when he realizes what befell the Jews, how they were deprived of humanity and treated like animals. This is a profoundly shocking discovery that does not allow him to live the way he used to. In these thoughts, he says to his late father, I won't be a Jew, Dad, but I'll be dead this way or anywhere or another, and I don't know why I feel that more and more. By going through the ordeal of an extermination camp, like nearly 1 million Jews, he accepts the unbearable truth of what a human being can become, including himself, in extreme circumstance with which the reader becomes familiar through the devastatingly dehumanized and sexualized scenes of the primitive struggle for survival. The protagonist thus becomes a Jewish warrior, as he begins to call himself. The chosen one, the way he is called by the Jewish zombie, the slangy word one means the number one person in a community. In the face of the coming fight, he mounts a huge yellow dump truck, like he would a horse, and speeds toward the shopping mall, cracking at its seams with that adherence to Judaism, in front of which an anti-Semitic crowd has gathered. He is ready to force the mall open. The White House one carries out a massacre on the Gallery Square. What? I don't slow down and drive through the roundabout. There is a crowd in front of me. Don't know how many are there. Can't really estimate crowds. Looks like a good concert or something up to 5,000 strong, perhaps. Not a superstar concert, but a solid performer maybe. I step on the accelerator and don't blow my horn. I drive into them, even if they can hear and see me. There is nowhere they can run. I wreak havoc. After a while, I start jumping a little on my seat to many bodies. I turn around, do the 8. They run in all directions, trample on one another, stampede like animals. I pull the string now and sound my horn like a merry engine driver in a smiling locomotive. A few more 8s and the square are mine. I look around to see if someone's perhaps moving, then I drive up and run over the sucker. He is like a Jewish messiah fighting with Gog and Magog, mythical figures that impersonate forces hostile to Israel. The sight of him is hidden behind the superficial face of someone permeated with pop culture. In moments of the especially successful attack, he congratulates himself with cool, just like Beavis and Butthead from the favorite American cartoon. He sums of his victorious leadership over the army of dead Jews with a rather profound statement. Quote, I'm standing here, nod my head, and imagine I'm Kevin from Home Alone 14, Kevin's adult light. He monitors the progress of his efforts through a surveillance system and issues orders through the intercom like a general on a battlefield. He is aesthetic in his cool, or when he shouts to the mic, move, assume position, set the escalator by the Leroy Merlin and then home appliances store. Of course, this is a grotesque scene when he sees, however, how the Jews that have rose from the dead in his cellar success in fight. He starts pondering on the earlier presence and today's absence in the Polish landscape. He realizes what an empty space they have left. What? I'm standing here with my mouth open, looking at them all and say, what the fuck, living Jews, I can see them at last. He is slowly prepared to die by a growing awareness of his mission. Looks like I'm really the chosen one. And when he dies, he contemplates his personal victory over himself, the devil, Germans, and my own nation, which he thinks is a grand finale. He then adds with a self-mocking, ironic humor. I'm feeling great, looking around for the others, thinking already what life a hero like me will have, what lover reads, regards, admiration await me. Finally, he dies in the battle between the Jewish zombie and the anti-Semitic, nationalist crowd of Warsaw people. He, what? Gives up his own life for the Jews, becoming one of them. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, Sławek, and also for your courage, because it's not easy to discuss a book while the author is sitting in the audience. We have some 15 minutes left for questions. So, please go ahead.
Can we see our colleagues if they are still there?
I think we're all intimidated.
I noticed that in many parts of my lecture, Professor Katzman was very smiling and happy. Could you tell anything about your experiences?
I'm not familiar with Polish literature. It was really illuminating, interesting here, but I was shocked by this diversity of approaches to the Jewish problem, the Jewish question, as we call it. Very interesting, and you know, I don't know where to start asking questions. Yeah.
Maybe about the genre. There were a lot of grotesque in these books, and I like it very much. And there is a huge difference between literature for adults and children's literature, Polish ones, because it's very daring in the literature for adults. Of course, they are doing this using this grotesque, but still, what do you think about it? About using this genre to point this difficult question.
I'm sure that this kind of literature can help us to feel the gravity of this problem, because I think that the main problem of the reception of this literature is connected with no reflection onto the gravity of the problem. And I think that this kind of aesthetic and this kind of thinking on Holocaust, on this hecatomb, this tragedy, is maybe not according to the history true, but is very, very important for readers. First of all, for young readers, to open their mind for new kind of reflection on this hecatomb, and of course for many readers this kind of literature can be difficult to absorb it, but I think it is very, very main, very important for first of all, I think about young generation, but not only young generation of people, of reader, but of course we can discuss about the form of it, about the aesthetic, but I think that in the context of memory, in the context of memorization of Holocaust, this kind of discussion should be on the other plan of it. We first of all must think about it, how to go to new kind of reception in the world, in Polish and other readers. I think so. I don't know what else can I say.
I learned from you something very important today, very interesting. Jews don't die. Simply no, they refuse to die. In literature, all the works that you presented, zombies, ashes, living ashes, I don't know, the D-books, Gilgul Neshamot, great. No, that's plan of Holocaust that I simply wasn't aware of its existence. It's interesting. It's after death life. All right. Yeah. Your question about why exactly? Yeah, why Jews don't die is an interesting.
This is open question. What is interesting that they only they don't die, but they resurrected.
Yeah.
It is the next problem, because the main problem of Christianity is that the main Jew of this religion resurrected.
This is a Messiah. There is a new type of Messiah.
Yeah.
Post-Holocaust Messiah. Curious one. The war of Gog and Magog.
Yeah.
As you know, we were thinking about this war as something eschatological. Yeah. And here, this post-Holocaust time is the eschatological one. Yeah, in this sense, in this case. So what was Holocaust? what happened? I already don't know.
We can find also discussion on the level of philosophy and anthropology that we live in the post-eschatological time. The Holocaust was the eschatological time, and now we lived after it.
Mm-hmm.
And this means that if we live after the eschatological time, we live in the new reality, completely another than reality before the Second World War and before the Holocaust. Maybe it is true, I don't know. I don't want to have the last sentence in this area.
The question is if we can have a memory without time, if we will post eschatological time, there is no time.
Mm-hmm.
What is the meaning of the memory in such case? I don't know. This is a post memory that Silvia was talking about? I don't know.
Yes, these texts Sławomir was talking about, they are post-memorial, and some of them in autobiographical way. They are based on the memory of the families, like Mangaranatu's Hyde Hill, the Italian Hyde Hill, or Bożenakew, yes, the story about the mother and so, but there are also post-memorial in connection with a place. So we have Stacja Muranów, we have Noc Żywych Żydów, yes, so, but I after your lecture, I was thinking about what next, because there is a very interesting line which guide us from Umschlagplatz of Marek Rynkiewicz and then I don't know, Zagłada, Annihilation of Piotr Szewc, and to these grotesque realizations. So I think the good question is what will be next, because what more is possible to say, yes, and what literary possibilities we can use to talk about Holocaust, and this is the, I think, Anchor Smith's question, Przemek repeated in one of his articles, if it's still about Holocaust. So, we're back.
Okay. No Holocaust, no history, no time, no memory.
Or maybe some kind of versions of memories. I don't know.
It's up to writers to decide. Our writer just ran away.
But I hope that it's not connected with my lecture.
Przemek pyta, o której jest spektakl.
19:30.
Dzięki.
If I can ask a question, what is the proportion of writers with a Jewish background in this group of authors you presented? Because of course, Mangaranaturi, Piotr Pazinski, the others, Ostachowicz, Masala, there is no Jewish connection whatsoever.
It is difficult to answer for this question because it's difficult to. I think that, of course, on the other hand side, it is very important to know something about the life context of their life, if they connect or not connect with Jewish background. But from the other side, I agree. I can agree with it. I think that it is more important to focus on the text, not on biography of writer. But of course, for instance, like Paziński, who many times declared his belonging to Jewish world, it is very easy to say, but there are many of them, of the writers, who write nothing about it. For instance, Sieniewicz. Sieniewicz is a very interesting example of it, because he wrote very important, but only one book in this area, in Holocaust and common culture. And maybe it is important, but for many authors it is too private and too difficult question to answer for it. If they are Jewish, they are not Jewish, this is problem. Of course, it's very interesting to see how the world of Jewish culture is reconstructed in these novels, but it's in many cases it's very difficult to answer for these questions.
And I think we don't have to answer these questions, because we are after this, I don't know how to call it, testimony term, so we don't need testimony anymore. So if you understand, there were strongly wanted after the Second World War and during these next decades, but I think not now. Now this is not important. And when Marian Hirsch said that there is post-memory already, we are in post-memory time, it was important that author has this family roots, these family connections. Then it was important that we have some cultural background, that Holocaust is everywhere, this virus of Auschwitz, Przemek also write about it. But now I think it's not so important anymore. We are in some other place, in the next place, really. So there was this testimony time, then was this post-memory term, yes, and now, I don't know. Yes, some, I don't know.
Because in
iterations.
The very concept of post-memory trauma is essential, because she defines it as an intergenerational or generational structure of transmission of trauma. But is there still some kind of trauma going on in Polish context, or?
This is a question for Sławek.
I think that the problem of trauma is one of the main basic problem of this literature, because we can see, if this is true, that not only people with Jewish roots write about the Holocaust in the US literature, that's mean that this trauma of Holocaust is not only Jewish trauma, but also Polish trauma and other nations. What does it mean? That traumatization of Holocaust was very strong, because we can see it not only in the context of the first generation after Holocaust, the witnesses of this event, but also we can see it in the next generations. What does it mean? That it is really very great. I have my private point of view on this problem, that in Poland we all need to opłakiwać, to mourn Jewish people, to mourn Jewish people, because never was the national mourning after Holocaust, and and they were the part of our society. Many of them were thinking about themselves that they are not only Jews, they are Poles also. And when 1.5 million Jewish children died, they were killed, and nobody say anything about it, how nothing was happened. It is difficult to understand, and I think that is the kind of traumatization, and you can see this part of us who live in Poland that there is many occasions to see that the people began to say something loudly about Holocaust, for instance, in media, in public discussion. There is a very great lament in this moment. What does it mean? That it is kind of how to say kind of ill of Polish nation which is connected with Holocaust. So this is very deep in our culture and in our body, and I think that this is task for us to rework it once again, to look for possibility to make a new relationship with Jewish people around the world, to mourn it together, these victims of Holocaust. I think so.
For this reason, for accomplishing this task, I have theoretical suggestion to you all that this concept of post-memory should be put aside already. We just should think further and or return to the, as Sławomir suggests, we can't live with this post-memory theory, with this conception. It simply, maybe it worked for a moment.
Yes.
Yeah, but now there is something not human about this conception, and I just suggest that we will think in new directions, in new concepts, and not be stuck with this postmodern, too postmodern theories that are already very fashionable now, and we can go further and search for new concepts, new theories, because we see that for Sławomir it's very important. It is memory, not post-memory. For Chris, the question of nationality is not the hard question. Yeah? It's a real question. It's interesting. It's not only curiosity of Chris, or they are Jews or non-Jews. It is important question, not only from the national point of view or cultural or psychological, but also from literary point of view. But we have to find the right, the fit literary theoretical concept to discuss this in literature, to discuss the culture, nationality in the literary text, without maybe returning to the archaic concepts. Yes, of the writer, okay, but we are after the writer, but there should be new ways. We can't not think about human. The post-human is now past. So we can't live with this. We should think otherwise, in new direction. And with this context, the presentation of Sławomir is very important. And the question of Chris also return us to the human path. All right, let's think about it because it's so important after all.
Yeah. We should finish because we must this place will be the performance for us, and they want to prepare us.
So we can go to hotel and
To the hotel, and 7:30 we can meet. Yes.